Okay.
Yeah.
Just to let people know, we do live stream this, so it'll be up online, but we do usually edit the questions out later on, so you won't be there for posterity. And we are live.
Okay, well,
I'll introduce you first.
Yeah,
You
okay.
can say-
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Hi everyone. I'm Charlie, one of the conveners, along with Matt and Kelly, who is virtually watching, but not with us this evening, of the food history seminar at the IHR. We're delighted to have for our very intimate session tonight, but we do have, I think, half a dozen people watching online. For Bryce Evans' talk about food and aviation in the 20th century. Bryce is a associate professor at Liverpool Hope University. He's done various kinds of work in British and Irish history and food history, including some stuff on World War I and World War II. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And his book, which is going to be very much related to what he's talking about, food and aviation in the 20th century, is coming out with Bloomsbury next year. So get your copies pre-ordered. And his talk is going to be under the same name. Bryce.
Great, okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, Charlie, and it's good to be here. Yes, well, my research is into food and aviation. There's precious little been written about airline food. Maybe that's because people like to forget it. Sometimes, a lot of people are not really great fans of airline food. But what I want to talk to you about for the next 45 minutes is what is commonly termed the greatest airline that ever was. One of the most recognizable American brands of the 20th century. Often marketing scholars say it was the second most recognizable behind Coca-Cola. And I want to explain how and why food was central to their branding, but how there was a lot more represented with food service. So themes of transnationalism, globalization, context of the Cold War, and latterly a competitive airline market. So I want to get on to my first slide, which is a refrain. A lot of people have asked me this when I said I'm doing a book on airline foods, and they said, well, really? When you look at images like that, now there's actually a website, you'll see it on the bottom right there, airlinemeals.net, and if you really want to look at some horror show imagery of airline food, there's a couple of examples there. And I'm sure we've all had an experience like that with airline food. But hopefully what I want to do today is explain why on earth I have just written a book on airline food. And I want to take us away from the contemporary horrors of airline food, the Ryanair hamburger, to an age of splendor and rolling cart elegance, a golden age. And I want to get to the essence of that golden age of airline food and whether it was a myth or a reality. And one of the themes that I want to explore is this idea of a very upbeat post-war American internationalism represented through food. And I suppose, we're living in an age today perhaps where we're seeing a sort of, dare I say, inward-looking nationalism in a lot of politics. So I'm going to get us away from oven-ready Brexit and towards oven-ready, glamorous food of the golden age, of the age, as you'll see in the abstract of this presentation, that age which Sinatra encapsulated in Come Fly With Me. So, airline food, really? Well, my answer is yes, because it tells us about all these different things. The big theme, the globalization of markets and the emergence of transnational taste, but also the idea of the airplane and particularly the Pan Am airliners as a transnational place. The idea that in a way when you stepped into the cabin of a Pan Am plane, you were escaping the nation state. And that was reflected in the national diversity of its staff. And it was reflected in, the imagery, the branding, the blue uniform. They viewed themselves very much as a United Nations, with an eclectic, well-educated staff with food offerings from around the world. But of course we have that idea of the globalization and transnationalism of the 20th century, the latter half. But of course we've got to examine the theme of that it would be American-led. Another theme, which I'll touch on briefly, is the extent to which Pan Am, although it was a passenger carrier, carried out a lot of work in terms of food aid. It was the unofficial carrier of the US government. It was termed the chosen instrument of of Capitol Hill, essentially. It was the chosen instrument, the monopoly that Pan Am had on US international flights well up until the 70s and well up until airline deregulation in 78. That monopoly that it had is really significant. And of course, Pan Am has an international role, and subsidiaries of it are there in big moments like the Berlin airlift. So that sense of food aid in the context of the Cold War. It really ties into this notion of the American century, and that's a term that Henry Luce, who's the publisher of Life magazine, uses in 1943 during the Second World War, and this very upbeat sense of American global leadership, the extent to which America would lead the 20th century, unashamedly so, would be serving the cause of civilization. And Pan Am very much viewed itself through its food as having a civilizing mission. It would be a civilizing mission in the American century. And Luce, when he uses that term in the 40s, he's talking about how the American century can provide global leadership different to something which has been provided before, different to the colonialisms of the old European powers. So a big theme in this presentation tonight will be the old world and the new world, and how through its food offerings, Pan Am tried and occasionally succeeded in collapsing those distinctions between old world and new world. And how this idea, as Henry Luce termed it, of the American century would be one of an upbeat, internationalist, almost humanist mission, distinct to the sort of greedy colonialism of the old European powers. Finally then, I want to talk as well about the science behind airline food, because a lot of the science behind airline food underlies fast food today. A lot of the things we take for granted in airline food today originate from Pan-American and that Second World War period, in terms of the flash freezing of food, the airline meal, the use of aluminium, and everything that does scientifically in terms of reducing dehydration. So we're going to get into the science as well. And the image I have here for you is, well, to return to my first question, airline food, really? I mean, look at that. Well, yeah, some people do want to recreate the experience of airline food. So that's a studio in Los Angeles where if you have $200 to spare and you're willing to divest yourself of it, you can go and sit in a studio somewhere around Hollywood which recreates a Pan Am 747 and get served by smiling, pretty stewardesses, actors, as you do so. And people pay $200 to do this. It's a very popular thing to do. So there must be something in airline food. There must have been, despite the myths, a romance. There must have been something that was worthwhile about airline food at one stage. So let's go on a little journey then to the early days of airline food. And initially, dining in the air was noisy, smelly, and uncomfortable. I think we've got to go back quickly to the airships. The airships, because of their sort of glacial speed, you were able to dine in the air. You often had fine dining with proper linen and courses and piano and cocktails. The problem with the airships was they were frequently very cold. But the early days of powered flight of airlines, they try and recreate some of that ambience. And really, they're going back to, and I'll return to this theme, the ocean liner experience. They're trying to recreate, although the technology doesn't and the space doesn't always allow, the experience of dining in an ocean liner. But in the first days of Pan Am, it's noisy, it's smelly, it's uncomfortable. It's a rickety experience. It's an experience that, if you imagine the vibration and the noise, one of the things that helps us appreciate food is the ambience, is the environment. And if you imagine how rickety and noisy and smelly in terms of the fuel and discomforting those original airplanes were, it's difficult to imagine anyone settling down to a nice meal. And that's where the purser comes in. And this is a picture of an early Pan Am purser. And of course, that's a nautical term, the purser, from the days of the ships. And the purser, immaculately attired, because it was such an unpleasant experience, I'm going back to the 20s and early 30s now, a lot was demanded of him in terms of performance. So a lot of the theme of this talk, and I've been very privileged to research at the University of Miami archives, but also to talk to a lot of retired flight attendants. And a lot depends then and today on the performative aspect of food, on what they could conjure up. And in the early days of the flying boats, the classic Pan-American clippers, the big flying boats, The purser would, obviously the distances were shorter. So you'd hop over from Miami to Havana, for example, or you'd stop off at the purser would stop off at local marketplaces, buy food, have it prepared, usually in great hotels like the Moana in Waikiki, places like that, and then type up a menu himself on a typewriter and then serve it on the plane. It wasn't a great experience, but because the purser was there, because he was creating menus himself, because he was almost a theatrical role, it made it bearable. And that was the age of the flying boats. Now, the flying boats flew at such low altitude that actually, as well as laying the table and performing the role of butler, and I think if you think about the demographic of who's flying in that age, the role of the early pursers resembled nothing more closely than the role of the butler in the big house. The entertainment aspects, the laying of the table, the rituals of dinner, again, coming back to that perhaps old world sort of patrician sense of dining. And simply because they're at such low altitudes, after dinner, the purser would just wipe the food debris off the side. They'd throw it out the back because they're flying so low, they could just chuck it out the back. Of course, you couldn't get away with that today. So one historian who sort of looks at this has said that in those days, flying was something like an ennobled flying picnic. The purser was the big house butler, and then at the end of the meal, he'd revert to the dishwasher. But airline dining evolves into something a bit more substantial. And one of the reasons it evolves into something more substantial is because of this man in the bottom right, Juan Terry Tripp. And Juan Tripp, who I'm sure some of you have heard of, Juan Tripp, but he's not the household name he really should be, because this man is responsible for so many of the innovations in the aviation industry. From the very sort of elite end of high dining, if you'll forgive the pun, to the extent that he champions economy food service as well. Now, Tripp was an interesting guy. He was a Yale man. He was from that sort of Gilded Age world of affluence, son of a stockbroker, moved in elite circles. And like, I suppose, a lot of so-called great men in history, he marries well as well. He marries the daughter of Edward Stettinius, the Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius Jr., Betty Stettinius, who then becomes Betty Tripp. So he's very much of that elite patrician world, if you like, that sort of Yale world of scotch and cigars and clubbiness and friends in the corridors of power. But Tripp, one of the things he really wants, and one of the things he eventually gets with the 747, is the idea of a double-decker plane. Tripp is a nautical man. He's been in the US Navy. He loves sailing, and he wants to recreate that ocean liner experience of airline dining. And one of the things he really wants is a double-decker plane. That's never able to be realised because of the technological constraints. He finally gets it with the 747 later on, with the famous upper bulge of the 747, the dining room of the 747. But all the conventions that Tripp brings in, from the traditions of the purser to the uniforms, if you think of the Pan Am blue, even your standard pilot uniform, Tripp is really a champion of that recreation of the nautical world in the air. And one of his great collaborations is with Norman Bel Geddes, so I'm sure you've heard of the famous architect designer in America. And one of the things they work on together, which is one of these great unrealized engineering feats, is something which Bel Geddes calls Airliner Number 4. It's a gargantuan airplane, not just a double-decker, but with several decks, with dining rooms, cocktail lounges, pianos, veranda cafe, and it ties in very much to Bel Geddes' famous Futurama exhibition at the World's Fair. The idea of the viewing gallery, he recreates that in his designs with Tripp, of this massive, essentially what they're trying to recreate, and they never really do, is an ocean liner in the air. And they want to recreate everything about the ocean liner experience, down to the fine dining rituals. The airships, like I've mentioned, have achieved this already, but the problem is, although they have the space to do so, they're cold and they're slow. But even down to, like I've mentioned, the uniforms, the terminology, what Tripp is trying to do with designers like Bel Geddes is recreate the ocean, like really create almost flying Titanics, where you could take your time over a nice meal. And again, when we fly today, we think there's so many distractions. transatlantic flight today, you've audio-visual distractions. Back then, so much depended on the food because it was such a long experience. A long, comfortable dinner was really a big thing. So let's go to the man who really, another unknown man behind airline food, who really should be a household name again, because he's responsible, love it or loathe it, for the airline meal as we know it today. His name is William Matson. William Matson is so obscure, he's been sort of erased from the pages of history. Haven't yet been able to find a picture of him. But suffice to say, he was a big man, and he liked his food. He was 300 pounds, he weighed 300 pounds. He was huge. He was a madcap inventor, former military man. But his big breakthrough, and why he's significant in airline food, is that in World War II, he comes up with something which, using the very conventionally upbeat, almost sci-fi language of the age, the sky plate. So that's Matson's big invention. What's the sky plate? The sky plate is airline food, essentially, as we know it today. And it's used by the American military, army, and air force during the Second World War in terms of troop transports. It was proven that morale was improved if you had a hot meal in the air. And Matson really invents this idea of pre-cooked, flash-frozen food, which is then heated in powerful convection ovens. The sky plate is born. And that is essentially the airline meal as we know it today. Small aluminium trays, frozen, prepared, and then put in very, very hot ovens and produced to smiling satisfaction like that. Now, Matson is an interesting guy. Big man, bit of a, the New Yorker does a sort of one of these little portrayals. Sometimes they do these pen portraits of people, don't they? And they do this really sniffy portrait of Matson in 1945. They're visiting him in his factory on the Hudson, and they kind of give this impression of just a bit of a weirdo who's obsessed with frozen food, because he serves up the frozen food for them, pings it in his super duper ovens. And the correspondent for the New Yorker says the food is sort of the kind of food you'd expect if doomsday were to arrive. Now, that pen portrait was actually published in the same week as the bombers dropped on Hiroshima. So it's a really bad bit of publicity for Matson. But Matson does invent the airline meal. The problem with Matson is he's an inventor, he's an engineer, he's a scientist. And these early attempts at airline meals are pretty horrible, really. A lot of the time they're wrapped in plastic and cardboard, they're quite soggy. There's not a great attention to the detail of the food. And that's where you get great airlines like Pan Am taking that technology, but then paying attention to the role of taste buds and the role of fine dining. So let's explore that a little bit. Now, you may have experienced this or you may not, but when you're in the air, now I interviewed for this project dozens of, about 20 or so former flight attendants, and the yarns were fantastic, and we'll get to the level of anecdote a little bit later, because you can imagine some of their stories are fantastic. But one of the things I noticed while interviewing these women, they were predominantly women, although one man who was a purser, is that none of them to a woman said that they ever noticed anything different about eating food in the air, that there was nothing different about that experience. And yet we know today, from a lot of scientific studies that have gone into it, that at higher altitude, with cabin air being drier, remember that the cabin air is pumped from the outside of the plane back into the plane. So low humidity, dry air, the outside atmosphere compressed, heated, pumped back in. Now that affects your taste buds in quite a significant way. A lot of the air stewardesses deny this. They said that because, again, a lot of them were taken with the fantastic food that they were eating, because they munched on food as well between service. And of course, a lot of them were coming from backgrounds where they'd never sampled things like caviar before, or some of the sort of fine foods of the world. For them, it was just a magical experience. But because of that lack of moisture, your taste buds are numbed. Your saliva glands are working overtime. You're more thirsty. And so today, you'll probably notice if you fly transatlantic, that a lot of meals come with fairly heavy sauces. They tend to be more heavily salted, more heavily flavoured. A lot of wines, the best wines don't taste the best in the air. So you might notice as well, it tends to be with your dinner a fruitier wine. You've basically got to have something which is saltier and more flavoursome. And it's Pan Am who carry out the first experiments with this and the actual effect of altitude and humidity on the taste buds, and design their menus accordingly. Now, they're doing that in the 40s and 50s when they're really leading the way in terms of forging their what they term civilizational mission around the world. We come though to the sort of classic age of Pan Am, the 747 period, the 70s, and the second jet age. And in a way, that was the sort of end of the golden age. A lot of people you speak to who've flown Pan Am, who had enough money to fly Pan Am, let's face it, reminisce about this, the fabled upper bulge, the second level of the 747. Now, it's quite interesting that was not elitism by design. Remember, Tripp is obsessed with this idea of a double-decker plane, a big ocean liner plane, where you'll have the space to move around and dine well. The engineers at Boeing say it's too dangerous to evacuate people in an emergency. You can't have 2 or 3 stories, but they do give him his upper bulge, and that, by accident rather than design, becomes the restaurant. Now, the stories about the fabled upper bulge in the 747 are legion, and you talk to a lot of former pursers and flight attendants who quite mischievously would seat people together who really they thought might not get on, such as Arabs and Israelis and that kind of thing, deliberately, so that they talk over dinner. And I think that's another key thing about airline food, is that conviviality, which we've kind of lost now, because you don't, your typical experience now with the tray table in front of you and your movie is not that experience of forced socialization, and they would force people together over dinner. In a way, a lot of that's the romance, isn't it, of the jet age of Pan Am, dining at that height, in that kind of ambience, that atmosphere with the cocktail bar and everything else. In a way, though, that ushers in the age of the herd, the sort of herd experience. Suddenly you've got 400 people occupying a plane for the first time. It's losing its exclusivity. And that is sort of symbolised when the first 747 is christened by First Lady Pat Nixon in 1970. And they don't use the traditional champagne, the nautical champagne. It's an artificial jet of something that looks like champagne. So I write in the book about how slowly, almost imperceptibly, dining airline was losing its glamour. But one thing they did have on the 747, because they had the room to do it, was this rolling cart service. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So I've just got a little resume of the science behind airline dining, just so we're all on the same page. First of all, in the 30s, there is a dispute whether it's the German carrier Lufthansa or Pan Am who served the first hot meals in the air. But certainly these two companies are the first to actually work with culinary professionals and insist that their staff go through culinary training. In the early days, and that's an early galley picture there, that's from the Foynes Flying Boat Museum in Ireland, that's an early Pan Am galley. The only thing they had in the early days in the 1930s, when those sort of early days of flight, were steam tables, fueled from the engine. So the fuel would come from the engine, and they would heat things up on these steam tables. Not ideal, and it didn't allow for sort of heating a lot of meals at one time. One thing that Pan Am does do in the 30s, and in line with this civilizational mission that it seems to have sort of self-appointed itself to, is experiment in hydroponics and flash freezing. And as we all know, and I'm sure you've covered in this seminar before, refrigeration changes the nature of food, absolutely. This flash freezing, pioneered by Matson, flash frozen food, oven ready, comes in the 30s and 40s. Hydroponics is really interesting as well. Pan Am is able to operate as the chosen instrument of the US government because it kind of blurs that line between private business and doing the state some service. And one of the ways in which it does the state some service in the lead up to war in the late 30s is it colonizes, if you like, the atolls of Wake and Midway in the Pacific, and carries out, through a lot of scientists, experiments in hydroponics, in growing, around about the same time actually, that scientists from the Rockefeller Institute are doing the first experimentations with genetically modified food. Pan Am is leading the way in growing food, hydroponics, growing food in an aquatic environment. And that's going to be crucial for the US in terms of its war effort later on against the Japanese. So again, this idea of Pan Am and its employees who you meet today, that they did the state some service, that they were effectively an arm of state. In the 30s as well, you get just things we take for granted today. Vacuum bottomed ware. That's another invention of Bel Geddes, the inventor who Tripp works with. And the surfaces, linoleum used for the first time, plastics used for the first time, vacuum bottomed ware, so the ware wouldn't go flying off if there was a bit of turbulence. And again, that speaks to this very modernist ideal of the company, this very modernist, the name itself, Pan Am, that sort of, all-embracing, very upbeat and confident modernism, working with very modernist designers from the Art Deco school and others. Like I said, in the 40s, we get aluminium for the first time used in a big way in aircraft design. That's what airplanes are made of for the first time. Lightweight, but critically for our enjoyment of food, prevents the dehydration of food. So you've got the taste, the flavour packed in, and the oven technology I mentioned. Now, by the 50s, you have greater safety constraints coming in. And one thing which and perhaps this is a little bit too darkly comic, but I find it enormously amusing, was that the signature of the Pan Am service, and I'll go back to Pan Am aspires, I'll talk a little bit later about this, to the high dining rituals of the old world. And the signature of its service from the 30s up to the 50s was something called the ice cream bomb. You really can't imagine aviation today, can you? The service of a bomb mid-flight. But it was Escoffier. Escoffier's bombe Nero, essentially. A big flaming, smoking dessert that they bring out at the end, which they had to retire because nervous flyers, you see flames and smoke coming from the galley, and a bomb emerging. It had to be retired by the 50s, when some of the magic and elitism was starting to rub off anyway. By the 50s as well, really interesting, and I haven't really got time to talk about this, but Pan Am works increasingly with NASA on the technology of taste buds in space. One thing which Pan Am established through its work with astronauts, and they work with the missile program. Pan Am really is an arm of state in all but name. And working with NASA and with the missile program, they kind of established that the earliest astronauts, the likes of John Glenn, the calming, these days, even if you fly sort of economy in America, airlines like Delta or whatever, sometimes you will get a sort of bag of peanuts thrown at you while you're on the runway waiting to take off. And that's something that's persisted from the 40s and 50s, where Pan Am establishes that the act of chewing, with astronauts especially, it has a very calming effect. So again, it's not necessarily something to do with taste there, it's literally the calming effect of chewing, the repetitive notion of chewing, in an era when a lot of people were quite scared of flying. Now, where does this all fit into ideas of American gastronomy and civilizational improvement? Well, Pan Am views itself as a sort of vanguard civilizational mission. It's established in 1927 by Tripp. One of their first routes that they operate, why it's called Pan-American, is they take advantage of the collapse of arrival, and they operate all the Latin American routes. And operating those Latin American routes, a lot of the time, company employees are hacking runways out of swathes of jungle, inhospitable territories, hydroponic experiments in growing on Wake and Midway. And you look at the company literature of that time in the archives, and they describe themselves quite unashamedly as the new conquistadors. Quite unabashedly, the new sort of white saviors of Latin America. So there's this idea of civilizational improvement, and it links to civilizational improvement through nutrition. As we get into the 20th century, there's this idea, as America matures as a country, that America should take on a gastronomy. That is something that if America is to aspire to a civilizational mission, it should really have greater attention to gastronomy. That the sort of old ideas of American eating, meaty, greasy food, for heavily calorific food for working men, that something had to change there in terms of health benefits. And you get a lot of health reformers. The first guy I mentioned here on the left in the book, Henry Fink. And Fink talked about how America should aspire to liberate itself from local food. And what he means by local food is the idea that you never travel outside your locale. You never experience food which is beyond your locale. Now again, refrigeration, the mass ownership of fridges in the 50s is going to completely change that. It's going to completely change ordinary people's enjoyment of food. But Fink, writing sort of more or less turn of the century, 20s, is talking about how Americans need to liberate themselves from local food. Now, what I argue in the book, if we're to go with the romantic image of Pan Am, is that Pan Am successfully does that in merging, or really pioneering this idea of the global as local. Because Pan Am tailors its menus to local flights. So it's flying to Germany, for example, West Germany, and have Rippchen and sauerkraut, for example, or different destinations. Clotted cream and scones for flights from New York to London. This idea that you can experience the global as local. And a lot of company propaganda champions that idea of the local as global and vice versa. So it's tying in to these sort of ideas from the turn of the century. Another brand which Pan Am associates it with, because this is a food branding exercise. Coca-Cola, which I've mentioned, but also Kellogg's and Heinz. These become really associated with the Pan-American brand. There's a lot of joint advertising initiatives, especially in the 40s and 50s. The classic American Clipper advertised with Heinz. Kellogg's, there's a lot of stuff that Kellogg do in terms of Kellogg's cornflakes and all the rest. But of course, Kellogg was himself a food reformer, who thought that diet was key to clean living, and bad diet encouraged things like masturbation and all the rest. Which brings us on to Horace Fletcher, the third guy there. Not a masturbator, but a masticator. And Fletcher was this, and I'm sure you've heard of Fletcher, this idea of Fletcherizing, the science of chewing your food repeatedly to break down, to get the nutrients from the food. So all of these kind of this thinking at the turn of the century, 1920s America, is tying into conceptions of food as a civilizational thing. And this is where we get this sort of marrying of the old and the new world with Pan Am, because the airline industry in general is quite slow to work with professional chefs. The European competitors, Lufthansa is very good at this in the early days, but by the time we get into the 30s and 40s, the European competitors, including British Imperial, etc., are starting to fall behind to the big Americans like Pan Am. But because America is so big, the airlines in America don't really work with professional chefs until a little bit later on. TWA, the famous carrier, does work with the Fred Harvey chain. It's the sort of start of this idea of situating airports near food hubs. But really, it's not a great fare. It's very much sort of snacks, biscuits, lemonade, that kind of thing. One of the things that Pan Am pioneers, and it's not the only company, but it's the company which does it probably most successfully, is working with professional chefs, and in collapsing those boundaries of the old and the new world, working with Parisian restaurant Maxims. And that is a partnership which lasts over decades, and it's one which is most fondly remembered by staff and people who flew Pan Am to this day. And it comes back to Tripp's fascination with recreating the ocean liner. When he honeymooned with Betty Tripp in 1928, they dined upstairs on the ship in a version of the Ritz. So you get brandy coming even into the ocean liners. And that was Tripp's mission, if you like, to bring that branded restaurant experience into airline dining. Other airlines do it. They work with hotel chains like the Marriott, but it's Pan Am who really make this link between Parisian fine dining. And again, it's that collapsing of the old and the new worlds. And what they're trying to do there is overcoming the inedibility of the Matson disposable plate, this pressed cardboard and plastic covering, and reinventing itself, reinventing airline food as something altogether more desirable. Now, Maxim's, the picture there in Paris, it's a staple of that kind of Belle Epoque fine dining era. I've never ate there myself, but it's sort of renowned restaurant in Paris, and it's from that sort of world of Belle Epoque glamour, which you've got to think of Juan Tripp as sort of forging himself in. The people who would dine there in the 20s would be the likes of Edward VII, Proust, Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, that kind of thing. And its owner, Maxims, throughout these sort of Belle Epoque and sort of interwar years, is very much, when interviewed about the allure of the restaurant as something in France, very much views the restaurant as an object of reverie. Yes, it's to do with the food, it's to do with the gastronomy, but it's also to do with the theatricality of rolling cart service, and it's to do with the notion of glamour in food service as well. And if we think about depictions of Paris from that Belle Epoque period, Manet, for example, the owner of Maxims said the key to his success was he'd always position a pretty girl in the window of the restaurant. It wasn't actually the food itself, it was a pretty girl in the window, getting people in. And you can see, in terms of what Tripp's trying to do with food service on Pan Am, you can see in terms of the image of the stewardess as it emerges, that it's this notion of glamour, that food could be glamorous through the serving, through the stewardess, that the old world and the new world could come together, the notion of glamour could appear, and that airline food could actually be good. And airline food was good, because in 1956, incredibly, really, when you think about it, and when you think about the conventions of the time. Am and Maxims, who are by that point in partnership, an American and a French brand, win 3 prizes at the International Gastronomic Exhibition in Frankfurt. It really is, for the first time, transforming this idea of the global as local. A lot of Americans who you speak to, in terms of the American embrace of gastronomy or cuisine or French cuisine, talk about Julia Child, famous celebrity chef, French cooking introduced on American screens in the 60s and 70s. But actually, the likes of Pan Am have got there first, because they're preparing sort of TV meals, aluminium, airline meal, Pan Am style, but made by fantastic and terribly snooty looking chefs like the man on the left there, made by culinary professionals, made in France. Actually, a lot of their meals were made in these big kitchens in Paris before being transported. And to all, according to everyone you speak to, it was really, really good food. And that's the sense in which aviation, the likes of Pan Am, because of their monopoly on overseas flights, and especially in Latin America, are transforming not just the gastronomic possibilities of airline food into something which is actually recognised as something of culinary excellence, but also the dining possibilities of the world, collapsing national boundaries, collapsing the times it took to get from different places to very, very short times. Tripp was often quoted. He had this idea. I mean, a lot of Pan Am was elite, but he also, like I mentioned earlier, had this idea of the economy traveller. And one of Tripp's ideas, his great plans, and something which he reiterates in a lot of interviews, is for the common man, as he puts it, to be able to fly from New York to Paris, dine underneath the Eiffel Tower, and be back in New York in time for supper and the theatre in the evening. And that collapsing of time and national boundaries, I think, is very interesting. And in the Latin American sense, remember, Pan Am operate all the routes in Latin America. You know, for your epicures sitting down in restaurants in Buenos Aires, suddenly they're able to eat lobsters caught on the other side, on the Pacific, the other side of the continent, brought over by Pan Am. It does transform the possibilities of fine dining. Okay. A lot of this stuff is archival based, but there were some quite interesting oral history interviews that I carried out with members of staff. And one thing that came up a lot, which these former members of staff experienced, was, of course, with the notion of glamour, with that notion of exoticism and airline dining as something really that the elites should aspire to, the many stories about drunken passengers. Now, a lot of the time, these stories about passengers imbued with drunken entitlement are quite sad. A lot of these women were groped just as a matter of course in their job. But you do, because airline food, because flying becomes something to do with drinking, an experience to sort of sample the world of the elite as much as eating. The birth of things, again, which we take for granted today, like the mini bottle of wine. Pan Am finds on its Latin American roots that its Latin American customers, they don't want to drink a lot of the time, but they want to have maybe that small glass bottle of wine to accompany their meal. So effectively, Pan Am invents the botellita de vino, the tiny, your customary small bottle of wine which you get on planes today. So many of the conventions date back to this company. It's incredible. But of course, you had these VIP diners, and there was one very good, and I'm going to share it with you now, and I hope you forgive the anecdotalism, and I hope I don't say anything too libelous here, and I hope Bloomsbury actually allow me publish this, because they might not. But it's a true story, so I'm going to tell it anyway. So I was interviewing a flight attendant, and she was telling me her first flight, 1971. They were taking off from New York to fly to London, and they're just taxiing, and she goes around the cabin. She goes to the first class passengers and asks them what they would like for their dinner. And they all choose the prime rib of beef. That was the sort of Pan Am signature dish on that service. Apart from one customer who blanked her. And then she went through the cabin again to take orders, and he wouldn't talk to her. They're in the air, and this customer, who's a young man, gets very angry because dinner service comes along. He says, where the hell is my prime rib of beef? I'm very sorry, sir. I did come around. I did ask. You didn't order it. Do you know who I am? I could buy every seat on this plane, he says. She says, well, I'm very sorry about that, but it's all gone. He then demands that she go and get the the food from a different passenger and bring it to him, which she refuses to do. Very angry, very indignant, very rude to her. 2 weeks later, she's hauled into Pan Am's global headquarters in Miami, where it has its famous 3-ton rotating globe. This image of sort of global dominance of Pan Am. She's very scared. She's only a 21-year-old girl. Into a group of senior managers to explain herself. A letter has arrived saying that she was extremely rude to a VIP passenger during food service. She has to explain herself, and she had to explain the situation. And it wasn't until then she realised that the rude customer was none other than the current incumbent of the White House, Donald Trump. So that was Donald Trump, aged 25 in 1971, demanding the beef. Now that's very anecdotal, but that's the kind of thing around food service that these women had to put up with. And they had to put up with an awful lot, because when you have 400 drunken adult babies demanding things in that manner, it's a demanding job. And so one thing I did in the book was look at the crew's perspective. And I looked at the perspective in the notion of glamour, what they wore, what they ate, and how they felt in terms of their working life. One thing that Pan Am does, and it pioneers, is to work with designers, some beautiful sort of sleek designs like this, Ivan Picon, classic Pan Am style. And we mentioned earlier on that classic Pan Am style of the shoulder bag. That was all part of the brand and the glamour, and the food service was integral to that. And Pan Am distinguished itself from other competitors. But, you know, in this period, a lot of other competitors go for the very cheap look of hot pants on stewardesses, you know, very revealing costumes. The TWA even have something which they call the foreign signature service, where they have young female stewardesses dressed in togas and things like this. It's just sort of ridiculous levels of sexualization. But Pan Am stewardesses very much viewed themselves as a cut above that, you know, that the design of the uniform would be a bit more conservative. You'll notice that the skirt there, this is from the 60s, is very sort of conservative, 2 or 3 inches above the knee. They would also go through rigorous culinary training at the Miami International Headquarters. And when you read the level of detail that went into the culinary training, it is fantastic. And you read in-house publications where a member of staff will say, we've started offering a new wine on this line. And then the guy who's in the company who's in charge of sourcing that wine from Burgundy or whatever will write an enormous introduction to that wine and the traditions and the history surrounding that wine. The idea being that they had to talk to passengers. They had to convincingly talk about the food that was being served, how it was prepared, where it was sourced from, what the traditions were, what the history was, what the culture was attached to that. And again, it's this notion of the global as local. But also a lot of these women had to put up with the reality of a pretty rigorous regime of weight checks. It was something which was a real gap in my knowledge. I didn't really understand this. I didn't know this was a thing. But throughout the sort of glamour and the golden age of Pan Am, a lot of the sort of pin-up girl glamour is underpinned by the fact that they're put on a scales every week to make sure they are they had a height maximum and an according weight maximum. And a lot of the women would, because they're in the air and they're snacking on very rich food, you know, chocolate eclairs, caviar, would just live in fear of going over the weight and the weight restrictions, which was really interesting to hear as well. Another thing that a lot of the food servers talked to me about was the extent to which customers may be rude to them, but also to the extent to which they really, a lot of times, didn't like pilots. Now, again, if you're a little bit of a nervous flyer, you hear some of these anecdotes and they really raise the hairs on the back of your neck. And one good anecdote, which I was told by a flight attendant, was that there was one. Now, a lot of these pilots of Pan Am were former military guys. They'd flown in Korea or World War II, conventionally, I'd say, chauvinist of the time. There was one captain who was a notorious bully and made a lot of the girls cry. He was notorious for just being very nasty and sexist. And one of the former employees told me a great story of how, back in the day, you imagine everyone was smoking on the plane. So one of the key things that they had, flight attendants, was eye drops, because they'd be passing through a smoky cabin all the time, and they'd have to sort of put drops in their eyes. And one day, this chap was so rude to her, this pilot, she couldn't take it anymore. So when he demanded that he get her his coffee, she made his coffee, and she said, put her eye drops into the coffee, stirred it around, gave it to the captain, had an enormous laxative effect, If you hear these stories, if you're a nervous flyer, you think, who was flying the plane? Well, the pilot rushed to the toilet and had an explosive bowel movement. But these are the sort of things that and a lot of the women who I interviewed talk to the high life of being a flight attendant. Yes, it was glamorous, it was sexy. Some of them were smuggling drugs. Some of them, a lot of the time, they were smuggling booze, cruise parties, champagne. It was a sort of legendary experience. To move towards some kind of conclusion, though, a lot of this golden age stuff around Pan Am is underpinned by an expectation that is essentially Orientalist. The whole myth of Pan Am as a global carrier, as a transnational space, as the United Nations brand almost, in all but name, with blue globe emblem and everything else, and international staff, the carrier of the nation of nations, the United States, is underpinned by the fact that, of course, a lot of the people who flew with Pan Am, despite the fact that Pan Am embraced economy in the 50s, despite the fact that Pan Am followed, older brands, the likes of Thomas Cook, in terms of actually having a hotel chain. They actually pioneered package holidays, Pan Am. They had intercontinental hotel chain. Despite the fact that it did economy, and Tripp envisaged economy for the common man, it also was flown all the time by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites with expectations of their servers. And women and men would be hired on the basis of sometimes the most impressionistic things, how their hands appeared. I've gone through the hiring notes. People turned down because their hands appear too veiny or too masculine. To do with it was that level of detail in terms of the serving of food. There was also an exotic expectation and an orientalized expectation. And Pan Am actually has been criticized and indeed faced lawsuits for overhiring as food servers Asian American women, especially Japanese American women, because of that notion, that very racialized notion of them as more effete, more demure, and underhiring African American employees. And that's quite a controversial aspect of Pan Am. But of course, when you think about it, it ties into that orientalized, exotic expectation around food serving and the food that is served. In its earliest days, Pan Am, the fare is stolidly American, 20s, 30s, 40s. You look at the menus, it's mostly fried chicken, mashed potatoes, hash brown, peas, ice cream, that kind of thing. By the time we get to especially the 50s and 60s, by the time of post-war, assuming this global leadership, it's a much more eclectic menu, and it's a much more eclectic staff. And a lot of the people that I interviewed were from all four corners of the globe where it recruited. And yet it did, of course, have that Orientalist or very sort of exoticized expectation to it. One of the women I interviewed recalled an occasion where a woman in furs and her partner, obviously, member of the sort of American sort of elite, spent 5 to 10 minutes guessing whether she was from Jamaica or Antigua, what part of the Caribbean she was from. She just kept repeating the fact that she was from Philadelphia. And they just didn't want that, because they wanted an authentic food server from the Caribbean. It was a Caribbean menu, so there were those expectations, of course, which were heavily racialized and of that time. In a Cold War context, and to move towards some kind of conclusion, Pan Am, of course, performed the role through its food service of soft power. It tied into this decades-long mission that Pan Am had, which it describes unashamedly in its literature of a civilizational mission. In the context of the Cold War, then, Pan Am's food service becomes, I think, transnational and eclectic. And it's to do with the contrast between the likes of Aeroflot, where, it is a lot more stark. It is that Cold War conflict, and it's a cultural conflict. So it's an America versus Russia thing. It is the standard bearer for American consumer choice in its menus. And of course that's linked to the brands it associates itself with, Heinz, Coca-Cola, and what some historians, theorists called, they would view Pan Am as an agent, essentially, cynically, of Coca-colonization, for want of a better word, McDonald'sization, the globalization, the sameness of everything. Another thing that Pan Am has to consider is that in the post-war period, with newly independent post-colonial countries, each offering their national cuisines, be it Air India, East African, with their own sort of typical cuisines from those periods, if it was going to aspire to be this nation of nations airline, it had to change its offerings. It had to incorporate what it, in the company literature of the 70s and 80s, is described as more ethnic foods, that kind of thing. And of course, by the time we get to the 70s and 80s, you get the sense that people's dietary needs are becoming more complex. Pescatarians, vegetarians, there's a lot more attention paid in the company literature to religious food choices, kosher food, etc. But another thing that's happening to Pan Am by the 70s and 80s, and by 1978 and the deregulation of the airline industry, which is really the end of the golden age, when the Carter administration deregulates the American airline industry, because that's really the end, or the final nail in the coffin of Pan Am's monopoly, or unspoken monopoly, as an American overseas carrier. And because we've then got that period of the 80s where every airline is pursuing economy, and every airline, Pan Am included, is pursuing economy. Pan Am is getting shabbier and shabbier by the time you get to the 80s, to the extent that there's such economy measures. It decouples from Coca-Cola. That's one big sort of harbinger of the things to come, that it's trying to save costs everywhere. There's a famous business studies case of Crandall's olive, and it's probably a little bit apocryphal, but it encapsulates the mood of the 1980s. This guy, Robert Crandall, head of American Airlines, presented with a salad, takes the olive off the top, reputedly a saving of $40,000 a year. Some accounts say $500,000 a year. I can't imagine it was that much. Maybe it was. But that's the point, that economy is becoming a big, big thing by the 80s. Pan Am then, going from a position of monopoly, is now pursuing measures of economy wherever it can. Everyone's flying. Flying is becoming a lot less exclusive. And Pan Am is appearing very much by this stage to be a bit of a bloated anachronism. And you read in the company literature how they're desperately trying to save money wherever they can. And one thing that comes in the 80s with different dietary choices is the sort of health foods revolution, if you like. People more conscious of what they're eating, what they're putting in their bodies. And Pan Am sort of cynically calculate that healthy food is also a lot cheaper. So by the 80s, the sort of deregulation has come in and increased competition. I'd just like to conclude then by going over a few points. I think that the history of Pan Am and food is fascinating. It's fascinating because it's an American brand. It's fascinating because of its self-appointed civilizational mission. It's fascinating because of the scientific advances that it pioneers and its engineering and scientific and nutritional research teams. It's fascinating in its work with professional culinary people. It's fascinating in collapsing the boundaries, successfully I'd argue, globalizing, so spearhead of globalization, collapsing those boundaries between the old world and the new. And one of the ways in which Pan Am is abiding, I'd just like to share with you finally, before I take questions, is when I was in Miami. I was fortunate enough, I did a presentation at the University of Miami, and I met with this woman who is pictured in the middle there. Renata is her name. Now, she's in her 80s, she's a German woman. She said, well, you must come to my house because the local chapter of World Wings International, which is the Pan Am Alumni Association, we're holding a dinner in my house. So there I popped into her house on this Miami suburb after getting off the tube or the whatever, and then I sort of found the address, walked into this house. I felt like I was Louis Theroux in one of those weird weekend episodes where he goes to America and meets slightly odd people, because as soon as I got to the door, there she was in her uniform, a woman in her 80s, but still with her Pan Am uniform. She was with this chap here, Harry Fram, who was a purser, again a German, in his purser's uniform. He's in his 90s, Harry. Everyone there was in their uniform from the period. When you went there, I was presented with a Pan Am shoulder bag and a ticket. I was shown to the cocktail lounge as it was, and then I was invited to board the plane. I had to show my ticket, sit down, and all the cutlery and crockery was Pan Am branded. When it collapsed, Pan Am, following the Lockerbie crash in '88, it collapsed in '91. The employees, so beloved was the brand, they took everything with them. The crockery, the cutlery, the uniforms, which they still wear slightly oddly. Even when I went to the bathroom in this woman's house, they had Pan Am branded towelettes. They had Pan Am swizzle sticks. They took the whole thing. They almost stripped the plane bare. But it was quite a weird experience. It was also a very nice experience because they tried to recreate that rolling cart glamour, and my goodness, what it was, an Epicurean feast I was treated to. Caviar and vodka and about eight different courses, each accompanied with the requisite alcohol. And it was really good fun. It was really good fun to talk to these people. One thing I did notice is that when some of the more lurid anecdotes came up, a couple of the sort of gatekeepers of that oral history were very much keen that I didn't portray Pan Am and Mr. Tripp, as he was still referred to, in any bad light. They really had an affection for the company, which shows, I suppose, the success of its brand and the success of its food service, because so much was to do with food service, and the abiding idea that actually airline food can be occasionally quite a nice thing. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, and some questions.
Okay, we'll have the questions now, and also I should say those people that are watching, send them on YouTube.
Yeah,
comments.
put it on YouTube. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Might have one from Kelly. Keenly watching. Any questions? I'll start with the question about nostalgia because we finished on that point. Like how do you negotiate that when you're coming out as a historian? Because clearly this is such a subject of nostalgia from like this perspective, like looking back at it now, and these people are doing recreations, have very kind of fond memories clearly of the brand and the company, but also the period of time, I guess, in American history, those booming decades. But also like there's something nostalgic, almost like though it's inherently like modernist in so many ways, there are also like weird aspects of nostalgia in the brand. It's like it's almost like postmodern, actually, isn't it? Like the nautical stuff. So like, I mean, have you kind of dealt with this question in nostalgia?
I found that a little bit of an obstacle because I think it is so heavily nostalgized. Be it the iconic shoulder bag, there was a Pan Am series commissioned by HBO, the American broadcaster, a few years ago, and it still lives on. There is a Pan Am private jet firm. There's the Pan Am store. It lives on in bizarre ways, in dinner parties like that. I think for a historian that level of nostalgia is a little bit challenging. It shows the success of the brand, sure, from a marketing perspective, but as a historian, even if one was approaching it, say, as a business historian, I think you'd have to try and dig beneath that because, as I've hopefully demonstrated, the food service was wonderful, but it was also underpinned by a quite heady mixture of sexism, racism, Orientalism, and you don't get any of that in the nostalgia. The nostalgia is all to do with Sinatra, Come Fly With Me, and the Golden Age and this kind of stuff. And you don't get any idea by the fact that by the 80s there were measures of economy coming in. And you don't get any feel for the idea that these food service, these women went through, really what they were going through was a training process to become an upper class housewife. Few of them lasted over a year or 2 years. They were all aged 21 to 27. They'd all been married within a year or 2 years to a pilot or a wealthy businessman. And of course, a lot of the food training was a preparation for hosting a dinner party, to be able to hold conversation and all that. So the nostalgia erases all of the conventional and of its time Orientalism, sexism, and racism. So to answer your question, I think you can indulge in the myth, but what I've tried to do in the book is get beneath that as well.
They wouldn't let them work once they were married, though.
No.
You had to keep quiet about it if you...
Or pregnant or divorced. The lists, the hiring notes are amazing, disgusting. What people were hired and not hired for, how their hands appeared, how their handshake was, whether they discovered that they'd once been married, whether they looked a bit too brassy. It's pretty elitist and pretty sexist stuff, but it's of its time.
They dropped that series after one series, didn't they? The Pan Am television thing. So maybe the nostalgia wasn't
perhaps
strong enough to draw audiences. I thought it was brilliant. I was absolutely hooked.
I didn't really watch. I suppose I should have watched it, but
a lot of the boy thing, really.
Well, a lot of the perhaps not. No, but a lot of the former flight attendants I interviewed were quite angry about that series. They said it represented us as tarts, and it was too sexualized. They really viewed themselves as the creme de la creme food service professionals, when Pan Am acquired National in the 80s, National Airways in America, they had a very snooty attitude to the new recruits from National. In fact, they regarded themselves through a food metaphor. They said, we're the caviar, and these girls from National are the hot dogs. You know, they did not like how sexualized that series was. I didn't see it myself, but apparently it was.
There was one in particular, a French girl who was a bit of a goer, I think.
Yeah.
in every hotel,
Yeah.
with every pilot. But it looked very glamorous.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
My own experience is I come from Hawaii, where they had an awful lot, a huge uptake of local girls for the Transpac flight service, but also to Europe. And the thing is, for these girls, Pan Am was absolutely the acme of what they might aspire to. This is, the pre-university days. And it was seen as a kind of glorious finishing school. Yeah. Where you could travel the world, you could meet an exceptional class of people. Yeah. You would also work with professionals, and you would be transformed. And people longed for it. The competition to work for Pan Am was just, huge. Also, later on, even if they were no longer flying, there were huge benefits. You had discounts if you wanted to fly. You got cheaper tickets. Your extended family could do it. But they felt they were joining an elite flight. Force.
It was something very aspirational for a lot of them. A lot of them who may not have come from backgrounds where they'd experienced anything resembling high dining before. No. It was, like you say, sort of a finishing school or an introduction to life as an elite housewife. And there's a great anecdote. I don't want this to be anecdotal. I think the oral history is important. And one of the retired purser told me that there was a girl who they always referred to as Captain's Girl, because whenever they were doing and how food service was integral to that social climbing. Because when they were supposed to be doing the flight safety checks before takeoff, she was always in the toilet scanning the VIP list, seeing where the sort of princes and wealthy businessmen and VIPs, diplomats were sat. And then her next thing was to scan through the cabin, and did they have a wedding ring on? Or was there, the white band indicating a removed wedding ring? She was very choosy. And, within a year she'd bagged herself, I think, a Texan oil executive or something. But that social climbing was all done through the food service. She would secretly, as she served food, be gazing at the list, gazing for the wedding ring, starting conversations. So amazing the extent to which food was used as a social climbing tool as well.
And you said that some of this was challenging for the historian, but not for the anthropologist. Because you have the company culture. And so what you've basically got is at least 2, if not 3 cultures interacting the whole time. And it's the mix that makes it absolutely fascinating, as mediated by the food.
It is an interesting mix. And I think a lot of the aspirations of Pan Am were of course, conventionally, Cold War Americanist and of their time and elitist, but they're also fairly noble in this sort of sense of this very upbeat internationalism and aspirationalism and globalized progress. So there's so many strands running through something so ostensibly simple as food service, which was absolutely integral to the whole experience.
How would the food have compared with, say, BAC?
They tried to make their menus a lot more eclectic and a lot more based on routes. As far as I know about some of the British carriers, they're fairly late to embrace foodstuffs going by destination, so incorporation of curries and things like that. It's really, as far as I can see, it's the American carriers, and in an early stage in the 30s, Lufthansa, who are really pioneering this attention to taste and attention to gastronomy. And I think by the 30s, certainly the 40s, the American, I think in the very early days, the European competition is a lot stronger. It's Daimler Airways, British Daimler Airways, who actually first employ a food server, a flight attendant. He's called a cabin boy. Again, it's so nautical. A cabin boy, a kid of about 14 who was serving food. But by the time we get to the 40s, it's Pan Am really leading the way. there's an interesting, in terms of the European competition, which you bring up there, there's an interesting episode in the 50s, which in the industry is known as the Sandwich Wars, because Pan Am gets very annoyed. There's an agreement in the International Air Transit Association that sandwiches or that class of food will always be cold, and on short hop flights you would always serve cold food. But increasingly the European competition, especially the Scandinavian airlines, start serving brilliant sort of gravlax and cheeses and hams and all this. And Pan Am really get their knickers in a twist and go to the IATA in Old and New World. They didn't quite like the idea of the old carriers coming into competition in terms of innovation of food. And if you think about it in terms of decolonisation post Second World War, if you're Air France or KLM, perhaps the national flag on the plane is a source of anxiety wherever you might be touching down in a former colony or whatever. And for Pan Am, because it aspired to this sort of United Nations or nation of nations, they really viewed themselves as the vanguard of modernity. So a lot of the time there's quite a lot of it's not an easy relationship between the old European competition and Pan Am, but they probably by the 40s and 50s are outstripping the European competitors in every way.
I have a question online from Kelly.
Kelly
Spring, who's one of our conveners.
Yeah.
So she's asking about nutrition. So did the issue of nutrition enter into the types of food that were offered, or was it very much about providing the most luxurious foods regardless of calories?
I think in the golden age, 50s and 60s, it's indulgent, luxurious food. It's that Escoffier ideal. It's indulgence, the ice cream bomb, the Bon Nero, and the very heavy, luxurious foods, caviars, chocolates, that kind of thing. As I mentioned, by the time we get to the 80s, that's when the sort of nutrition comes into a little bit more. I think it very conveniently intersects with economy imperatives, because nutritious food is proven to be a lot cheaper, essentially. Although they do work with nutritionists from the early stages, and in terms of trying to work out, especially in the 40s and 50s, what happens nutritionally and in terms of taste in the air, they do work with nutritionists. But I think in terms of counting the calories, that doesn't really come into the 80s, by which point the whole golden age has kind of disappeared anyway, because the whole market's opened up. So to answer Kelly's question, hi Kelly, I think it's the 80s where the sort of attention to nutritional science comes in as a convenient way of making food service a lot cheaper.
I was going to say there are two things that I remember about Pan Am. One is that they made a big thing in first of service, in the sense of bringing out something that they then carved and bringing out a salad that they then tossed, making it very clear that it wasn't all pre-plated. And that was essential. Also doling out the caviar. The other thing was the mystique of the round the world flight, which I'm sure other airlines, did patch around the world, but they did the, big thing about a plane that was going around. And
First round the world flight,
the last round the world Pacific flight. And it left Honolulu when it was going all the way around, and we got off in Samoa. It was going on to Tahiti, and everyone was sort of in floods of tears, also laughing, and everyone was drunk. It was like one large party, because the attitude was, this is the end of the known world. This is breaking the link. This is I mean, it was high tragedy. But it was very interesting in terms of company culture.
There was a tremendous, and again, nautical pioneering aspect to all of this. And when they crossed the equator, the captain would dine on steak, like they would in the nautical tradition. And this very much this sort of pioneering, conquistador, this sort of virgin territory sort of ideal, which was to do, which at the time it was the forefront of modernity. Collapsing journey times from a matter of a month to a couple of days was
so exciting. There was the excitement of flying, which was very much part of their world.
But in terms of the Hawaiian, they seem to collaborate a lot, even from the early days, with the famous hotel, the Moana in Waikiki. So they were working with culinary professionals, but it's that partnership with Maxims, and that's where, like you mentioned, the rolling tray service. That's very much that Parisian model of rolling tray, the performative aspect. Always finished off with the signature garnish of parsley. I think is very much borrowed from that Parisian sort of belly pock. That idea that escapism and reverie in the restaurant. And I think Pan Am's amazing because they embrace that old world tradition so wholeheartedly. Again, adhering back to the kind of people who flew Pan Am at the time who were of that, moneyed, waspish type. In a way, it was quite imitative a lot of the time. Some of the stuff you look at is a little bit embarrassing in terms of its sort of old world imitativeness, but it at least makes an attempt to sort of, in a globalized sense, bridge that divide, which is very much of its time.
Did you come across anything in the archive before the olive about the economics of serving and preparing and sourcing and carrying? These days everything is, as far as I can tell, a lot of like flight catering is done by these big multinationals like Sky Chefs, and they've got the flight kitchens in international hubs, and they then provide every airline. Now Pan Am, in terms of the economics, it does everything in-house up until the 80s, when it starts to find everything too expensive. They do, from the earliest days, 20s and 30s, like I've mentioned, some of those air routes in America, you do have sort of cheap sort of flight kitchens situated in different cities. But that becomes the model, that you'll have a kitchen based in an airport terminal. So again, food is transforming the very nature of the airport terminal as well, because the airport terminal at the same time, you've not just got these flight kitchens located there, which is achieving economies, but suddenly the airline terminal is becoming somewhere where you might go to a restaurant. And so as the industry takes off, especially into the 50s and 60s, the idea of the airline terminal is being transformed as well. Pan Am doesn't seem to be too concerned with economies right up until it's really 78 and deregulation, and then suddenly they're encouraging stuff, not only things like the olive, but encouraging stuff to salvage, which is maybe why a lot of the former stuff still have all this stuff. Salvage and reuse things like plastic swizzle sticks, and things like this, and it's not until they lose their monopoly position, I think, that they really start to fret about economy in a big way. A lot of it comes down to Tripp, actually. Tripp retires in the, I think, 68, 69. And I think he really embodied that sort of Yale world of clubbiness and fine dining. And they were, because they were so big and because they had a monopoly, they didn't seem to have to worry to the same extent about economies. But it starts to come in post-war, when they start to get increasingly worried about foreign competition that is able to avail of national subsidies. So nationalised airlines in other contexts, Aeroflot, for example, because they never receive, although they have the routes and the sort of monopoly, they never have a sort of government subsidy. They're always a private company. But yeah, not until the 80s does it start becoming mean in the way that we kind of recognise, the kind of nickel and dime operations we see today.
I don't know if this is named, but did they at that time, were there different distinctions between class of travel?
Yeah. Pan Am is one of the pioneers in the 50s of economy travel, and you've got all kinds of variations it brings in terms of food accordingly. I can't remember the rainbow service and all the rest. Yeah, but you had essentially that first class economy class divide. But for such an elitist and snobby brand, Tripp pioneers the idea of like the package holiday by air. You've got this hotel chain, the intercontinental chain of hotels. By the 50s, and as planes are getting bigger and greater capacity, he's very much for this idea of the common man overcoming Cold War tensions in a spirit of internationalism by sort of being able to fly around the world.
through economy service. Mind you, it was still a good deal more expensive than competitor airlines, even in economy class. But there were different foods that were served in classes as well. But that starts to become collapsed a little bit later, because you find some offerings in economy class start to be viewed with jealousy by people in upper class. I think it was the Cornish hen or something. It was an economy thing. Everyone in upper class wanted it. And so whenever they try and have these boundaries, I think as well on a lot of their Latin American routes, they'd be sort of, you'd speak to some of the retired people and flights to places like Puerto Rico, and for some reason, so it's a Hispanic destination, but for some reason they're looking at the dietary requirements, and like 50, 60 people have ordered kosher food, and like, this can't be right. It's because the kosher food was a hot food offering, whereas the other offering was cold. So I think where they do introduce distinctions, they kind of realise fairly early on that they're shooting themselves in the foot. So it becomes, in a way, I mean, without wanting to buy into that myth of Pan Am, it is quite democratised in a certain way. I mean, if you could afford to fly it, it was a pretty nice experience. You had to book the Upper Bulge, the restaurant that had that restaurant feel to it. You'd go up there and you'd have your coat taken, sheepskin seats and all the rest. But in a way, within that elitist idiom, it's fairly democratised from an early stage, certainly from the 50s, which is quite interesting.
Can I ask about breakfast? Because most of what you talked about are sort of dinner type meals,
Yeah.
lunch type meals. Did they do breakfast, and were they known in any way for the kind of meals?
Yeah, they were famous for their breakfast, and the breakfasts were prepared fresh. And of course, that notion of fresh in history is so contested, isn't it, in terms of what is fresh? And one of the things they're successful with is convincing people that frozen food can be fresh, that the refrigerated, heated up can be fresh, that can still be fresh food. Which I think is, and think of everything that spawns. In a good way, that idea of breaking down culinary boundaries, and in a bad way, that idea of the airplane meal as ushering in the throwaway society, jiffy pop, and the kind of TV dinner and all the rest. But to come back to breakfast, they would prepare omelettes. That was their sort of signature dish. Problem was, they found when you get to higher altitude, the eggs tend to green. That was their biggest fear, these flight attendants, that they would take their eyes off the eggs, they'd leave them for a little bit, and they'd start to green because of the altitude, which obviously looked very unappetizing. So there's lots of horror stories about eggs going green and all the rest. But yeah, the omelette was their signature, with a singular garnish of parsley on your coffee, prepared by the flight attendants themselves, which is, It did do a bit of cooking up there as well, which is quite interesting.
Okay, that's interesting. Are they cooking on what are they cooking on?
Steam table. And then, of course, the ovens. I mean, and ovens give you capacity. The microwave never takes off in the air, mainly because they're just not big enough. When you've got these big convection ovens, especially when you've got the 400 people on a Boeing 747, it's a lot easier to take out. And still to this day, I think, in the industry, microwaves aren't used very much. There's a story last year I dimly remember of British Airways stewardess who I think they do have microwaves, and then she put some sort of something in the microwave, and my goodness, there was like £40,000 worth of damage or something, and there was an emergency landing. So microwaves tend to be not trusted. It's not just because of capacity, but because of the ability to explode and all the rest.
I have another very practical question about the experience of flying in this period, in the glory days of Pan Am, versus kind of what we experienced in the last 20 years, whatever, and how that's changed and how that has affected what food, like dining cultures and stuff, are possible. Because people seem to be walking around a lot now, in this point, and there's a lot of dressing of salads and cooking of omelettes, and now, for various reasons, I guess people are much more restrained. You're forced to have your belt on and encouraged not to move very out. They'll maliciously put the light on so you can't go up and walk around because there's some turbulence, but they just want you to sit down, kind of thing. So how was that different? I mean, were planes quicker, slower? How does it?
Well, I think the economy imperative comes in. So 747, you're although it's spacious, you're getting 400 people. Like the herd is sat down. Stuff before that in the 50s, like the Strato Cruiser, which was really kind of created like the sort of sleazy nightclub, and you had this sort of mirrors with walls, and your cocktail bar lounge, and you would kind of dress for dinner and go to dinner, and it was very much that kind of older ocean liner experience, which I suppose ties into that notion of golden age, rather than just eating something on the tray table in front of you. But yeah, certainly today, you look at Airbus, etc. They're confined in space, and you're sat down. They don't, unless you're you still have in some airlines the sort of upper bulge and a lounge and that kind of thing. Although I can never afford to fly with these airlines. But I'm told these days that the best are the likes of Singapore Airlines, Etihad, Turkish Airlines. I think are pretty renowned for good food service. But you see in other parts of the industry, I think a lot of people would agree that even great old carriers like British Airways, the standard has sort of become this sort of Ryanairization has been quite pervasive, and again that's an economy thing of getting 400 bums on the seat of a 747 or whatever. But yeah, the design's influences how food is eaten. Back in the 50s, your lounge area, your sort of nightclub area, the bridal suite, which they'd have, back on the old Stratocruiser, to the familiar sort of herd experience that we have today. Although, again, I never can afford to fly in these airlines, but someone was telling me that, you fly business class with Etihad and the likes of that, and you've got all this, and you've got showers, and you've got all kinds of foot rubs and sweets and all this kind of stuff. But I wouldn't know anything about that.
It's interesting how it comes back though. I mean, compare it to train transport, train dining, because Great Western Railways reintroduced the dining car as a big thing and trying to get people to book that. So whether it can come back in some ways, and luxury for some people that can afford it. And these things are not necessarily dead, actually, are they?
Yeah, and that separate sort of dining car, the early days of actually having a separate like dining, that's really the equivalent of the dining car, isn't it? And equivalent on the flights from the 30s. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's interesting how people interact, and those anecdotes about seating different types of people who might not get on together. I think that's fascinating. It's so much more social. I mean, although this is a very elitist idiom, the whole thing, it's so much more social and communal than what we're used to today, which is a very sort of privatised and singularised, tray table and movie in front of you experience. And that in itself is a tremendous social history, which is kind of gone in a way.
No
more questions.
Great, we'll round off there. Another round of applause with Bryce, please, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.